And it's my pleasure now to introduce Gert van Santen. And excuse me again for the pronunciation if it's not correct. Gert is a fishery specialist at the World Bank and the FAO, advised also other development institutions after his retirement. He supported the growing global role of small-scale fisheries, evaluating sector strategies and designing marine fisheries and aquaculture investment activities in over 30 countries. He initiated what ultimately became the Profish, raising World Bank bilateral donor and client countries, raising the awareness of rapidly expanding fisheries sector needs. He currently explores how resource management theories historically have dealt with the complexity of fishery systems, interconnecting political, institutional, trade, financial, and bioeconomic factors, which is indeed very much centered and in focus for the side event today. So Gert, please go through your presentation and give us some overview on these different topics of small-scale fisheries.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to, because I'm one of the last presenters, I'm going to repeat a few things that you've said before. I haven't seen your earlier presentations before, so I'm sorry about that. What I'm going to talk about is governance and uncertainty, and particularly with respect to the marine environment. And when I talk about governance, I talk about everything that happens on land. And everything that influences human behavior, somehow or another influencing the marine environment. And as everybody has explained, marine fisheries, and I'm particularly talking about marine fisheries, not so much about shipping and oil and all these other things that are also important. When I talk about it, particularly with respect to marine fisheries, they operate within complex adaptive systems. Control is absolutely relative, and so is the success of aiming at control. And what some of you already have suggested, a systems approach can reduce but not exclude these uncertainties. The first question I have when I was asked to look at this is, what are the options to reduce uncertainties? Can we find moderation of risk within the existing management approaches and models that currently are being applied? Or do we have to focus on things that currently do not fall within those management approaches? And before I continue about this, I want to make one observation that is, I think, important if you talk about the Atlantic. We have the north, we have the center, we have the southern part. But in the center, we have a situation which is very unlike what it is in many other parts of the Atlantic. There are two crises. The first is the gap between demand and supply of marine fish is expected to reach 15 million tons in West Africa, in the coastal areas, by 2030. That's 8 years from now. Why is it increasing? First of all, population is still growing relatively fast in Africa. Secondly, particularly the middle class is earning quite a bit more money than it used to. And thirdly, fish is the preferred source of protein in these countries. The second real crisis they have is that the number of people engaged in marine fisheries along the Morocco to Congo coast is an estimated 6 to 8 million people. Half of them are small-scale fishermen. That's 3 times the number of all sector workers in all other countries bordering the Atlantic. And the average catch of a small-scale fisherman in most of these areas is roughly 0.5 ton per year. So there is a huge problem in terms of employment and in terms of income. So compared with the rest of the countries bordering the North and South Atlantic, the African countries face a substantially different set of resource management issues and management issues in general. There are limited coastal resources except in Mauritania and Namibia, and there is very weak resource management regimes. Now, coming back to the systems approach, there are many different varieties that you can apply, and I only want to look at one, which is looking at the long term and what is needed at the short term. And if you do that, you have to incorporate in the design and implementation not only strategic, let's call it wish list kind of things. You have to look operationally what is actually feasible and possible given the current and future circumstances. You need practical objectives and broad participation, and particularly that latter part was already indicated by some of you before. So you need a vision for either the whole Atlantic or for certain regions. But at the same time, you have to accept that in trying to reach from where we are currently to something like 40 or 50 years from now, you have to make frequent short-term adjustments in implementation plans. And that adjustment is probably the most critical part of it. So if you talk about vision, it's not only environmental sustainability that we're talking about, it's also enhanced well-being of people that are involved in this, reduce inequality, increase system resilience, and not just the marine environment, but also the coastal environment where people live. You have to integrate absolute limits, things that absolutely should not happen in those 50 years. Mary already suggested there are technical and product innovation. I'm absolutely convinced that 50 years from now, we're going to have different fisheries technologically, but also very different fish products. And that means there's consumer adaptation as well. All those things need to somehow or another be reflected in that vision. Who should be involved in this design process? First of all, not only the fishermen, of course, not only the scientists, there are politicians, there are all kinds of other interest groups that will have a need to say in order to design this. How should it be done? Starting high up and then trying to bring plans to a local, smaller local level, or the other way around, starting at a low level and then going up. Key question also raised before, who is the authority who at some point should monitor this whole process? Is that a scientific, something that needs to be done by scientists? Should it be an organization? Should it be an international organization? Things like that. Same with monitoring. And same with what is the power that they have that once things don't go well, what kind of action can they take to make sure that it's moving in a different direction? The whole process of looking at something that is 40 or 50 years from now and then saying, okay, how are we going to cut up this process in groups of years, 2, 3, 4 years, is also, it's probably going to be a very messy process, but it is also an essential part of it. And finally, there's the whole question of tactics. How do we implement something that needs to be working over a fairly long period of time? As far as the adjustment is concerned, there is the when, why, and who. When should, at some point, when should there be an adjustment in the process that is taking place? When key vision or strategy objectives and reality substantially deviate, obviously. Why? Because of foreign interference, or because the system itself is changing. Climate change is one thing, but there are many other things, political, that can have an influence on this. And finally, who should determine to make the adjustment? Is it scientific institutions? For example, look at ICES in Europe or SPC in the Pacific. But there are many different possibilities to structure it. And you have to take into account, and that is particularly true in the middle part of the Atlantic, the impact of governance capacity differences. What can reasonably be expected where? What are the different roles of leadership? I was very much impressed by what is happening right now in Brazil, but also what really scares me is that this whole process, and if I look to the European Union or the Pacific, you have exactly the same situation. Setting up a system that actually looks at this can take 20, 30 years. Obviously, what is the role of the local public sector, finance, employment, who wins, who loses, who needs compensation, how can it be financed? reference is made to the role of gender in this whole thing. In West Africa, that is absolutely crucial. What's the role of markets? The trade, should it be open? Everybody can fish in the Atlantic and move it somewhere else. What is the role of social security? If you live in Norway and you're a small-scale fisherman and you can't fish for 2 years because there's no cod, there's a social security system that works reasonably well. Such a system doesn't exist in Nigeria or in Senegal. And finally, there is this whole process of linking science, politics, and media, something that 20 years ago didn't really exist, and right now is absolutely crucial if you want to influence what people are doing. And finally, obviously, the role of external agents, transparency of all the deals that are being made with respect not only to fisheries, but to a lot of other oil and exploitation in the oceans, the kind of secrets that exist. And last but not least, obviously, the power political structure that are taking place and what you, for example, currently see in the Pacific between China and the United States. So last slide, what should research focus on? First of all, look at whether it is possible to develop this vision and adjustment strategy. Is that an option, or should other ways be found? And secondly, analyze the need for institutional and process adjustments with respect to the current situation. Where is it absolutely essential that some changes are made? And I'm not suggesting that the European Union or the Americans, Magnus-Stevens Act be changed and things like that. But you have to look at whether in practice some changes can be made. Define and create a broad framework to get in the decision-making process for the oceans, the information that needs to come from land, economic aspects, social aspects, policy institution aspects, that can integrate the decision-making with when you look at the oceans and fishing management and things like that. And finally, define what kind of information do you really need if you make decisions about the oceans and about fishing and about exploitation. And I've made a small list here, but there are many other aspects that could play a role. Industrial and rural development strategies are important, particularly in developing countries. Regional financial policies, again, in the middle of the Atlantic, are absolutely crucial, given the role, for example, of the European Union and China operating in that area. What are the financial and industrial regulation in the countries that somehow support or do not support adjustment of the sector? What is the role of corporate reform? Right now we are in a situation, for example, in the tuna industry, that half of all canned tuna is being produced under the aegis of one single company. Is that something that you want in the Atlantic? There's competition and tax and trade regimes in terms of what kind of role do you want to play? Do you want small-scale fisheries to play? What should the industrial fisheries role be? And can it be separated practically? If you want new investment in the sector to adjust to a better situation, you need to do something about wealth and ownership taxation regimes. And finally, last but not least, labor markets are very important particularly in small-scale fisheries in this part of the ocean. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gert. Thank you. Also to provide some numbers here that to me are a bit scaring. I mean, maybe as a oceanographer, we are more used to the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that we are facing now, but maybe less clear about these social crises that are developing. At least, I mean, the numbers you provided for the West Africa, 50 million tons gap between demand and supply. That's a big number. And
yes, particularly if you take into account that right now the imports of fish from the rest of the Atlantic is about 2 million tons. Yeah. And so, yeah, that is going to increase very rapidly.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I mean, has an interesting or well, scaring feedbacks on the ecosystem, the local ecosystem there, because you also, the other number you provided were the 6 to 8 million people employed in the small scale fisheries in these countries. That, of course, I mean, they will demand more from the ecosystem that is already stressed by many other factors. And,
absolutely, yes.
So, well, we can probably elaborate a little bit more on that, and also maybe to identify some hope and some methods to resolve these type of conflicts.